For more resources, visit rym.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hey everyone, this is Michael Hall, Director of Training at RYM. Before we get to today's podcast, I want to invite you to join us at our annual Youth Leader Training Conference. YLT is an incredible week of equipping, connection, and encouragement for you and your ministry. We're excited to offer 2 locations in 2019, Nashville, Tennessee, and Paradise, Pennsylvania. Feature speakers include Sandy Wilson, Walt Mueller, Julie Lowe, Duffy Robbins, and Scotty Smith. Registration for both locations is now open. Please visit rym.org/training for more information and registration.
Hey everyone, we are back talking with Nicholas Black at Harvest USA. Nicholas, in your years with Harvest USA, I think you said 2007, is that correct, when you came on staff?
Yeah, I came on board. Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's been around as a ministry for 35 years, as we said. But what have been some of the discouraging trends that you've witnessed, you know, in reference to the church's teaching or lack of teaching, discussion, conversations, thinking, you know, about sexual issues? What are some of those discouraging trends that you've witnessed really with your time on staff, but even prior to your time on staff?
Yeah, you know, it's one of the things that's most interesting to me as I came to Harvest 11 years ago was Harvest started in the late 70s, early 80s, and shortly after its beginning as a ministry that was reaching out to a forgotten people group, gays and lesbians. Church was shunning them, demonizing them, excluding them. The AIDS crisis began. And there was a national hysteria, as you can imagine, about AIDS. And my own experience was seeing and hearing about and meeting people whose were told by churches to leave because one of the married partners had AIDS or the children had AIDS. Harvest USA started a branch ministry at that point called Hope. And it was entirely a ministry that was reaching out to gays and lesbians, mostly overwhelmingly gay men who had AIDS. And they would visit them in the hospitals. They would pray with them. They would visit them in their homes. It's a great ministry that eventually ended because the AIDS crisis ended through some, excellent medical intervention. But nevertheless, that formed the background of Harvest. And so one of the trends back then, which I think is changing, but it's still there, John, is that people who struggle with sexual issues, that's the worst type of behavior. It's the worst type of sin, especially if you're gay or lesbian. And so we are still seeing churches that are harsh with sexual sin for those who are same-sex attracted and less so for those who have your standard run-of-the-mill sort of heterosexual behavioral issues. That's a discontinuity and a disconnect that is wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's wrong to do that. So we're still seeing that, for instance. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of men who come here to our sexual support groups for pornography and same-sex attraction. And we have separate groups. They merge at some point, then they pull away because those with same-sex attraction within the church are dealing with other issues. And one big issue that many men deal with is that they don't or cannot go to church leadership and pastors because there are still too many pastors and leaders who are derisive of gays and lesbians, make comments about people who are gay and lesbian, who make jokes about it. You can't go to somebody and say, I'm struggling with same-sex attraction, and the person you're going to has dismissed and derided the very thing that you're struggling with. There's no safety there. So we're still seeing that trend. Secondly, we still see the trend of silence. I think silence is still one of the major trends in the church.
Yes.
This is an issue that's too awkward, too painful, too messy to deal with. So we're still seeing that. But I'd say, just as a quick aside here, John, I think it's getting better. I think I'm seeing, and we are here at Harvest, seeing more and more churches saying, we haven't talked about this, we haven't talked about it well, we need help. And so we're getting more and more churches that are repenting of the way that they have treated these issues, and they've treated people in their congregation with these issues. But you won't hear that story from the media. What you're only going to get from the media are these wacko, distorted, sadly true stories that are out there that are on the fringes of all sorts of behavior, where you might have certain people within smaller churches who are saying horrible things about those struggling with same-sex attraction. That's in the minority, but you won't know that from the media. That's what's going to get pressed today. So there's still the sense that sexual strugglers are the worst sinners, that silence still is predominant. I would also say that one trend that we still see is that sexual discipleship, in a good way, is still more on a morality base than what we call a union with Christ base. It's rule based. That was very much the case with the abstinent programs more than a decade or so, which were in the ascendancy back then. You know, the abstinent message, and I don't want to disturb people who, I'm all in favor of abstinence until marriage. That's the way to go. But the message that was coming from that is, if you just wait, God's going to give you your princess or your prince, and your sexual behavior then as a married couple will be just wonderful. That was a false narrative. What we want to be teaching is the reason for being abstinent, the reason for being celibate, the reason for managing your sexuality in a way that God calls you to is based on your relationship with Jesus Christ. That it's about you responding to the same Holy Spirit that raised him from the dead, that now lives in you. And he wants you to be the best that you can in Christ. That is meaning that you're going to say no to some things in your life so that you can say yes to other things in your life. It's that type of equation. Whatever you say no to is going to be replaced by God's greater yes. We want that message to come out. So it's not rule-based, it's not morality-based per se. It is, how do you honor Christ with everything in your life, and with what is actually the most powerful part of our human personality, isn't it? It's our sexuality. God made it powerful, but he also made it powerful so that we might know something of his longing for us, and secondly, his pursuit of us, and thirdly, so that we might not deal with this matter alone, but that we would be doing it within the community of Christ. So those are the three things we're still seeing as unfortunate trends within the church.
And that's why this is such an important conversation to have, because what you just said, the depth and richness of biblical sexuality, I mean, there is so much there that is having this kind of negative discussion about the church, of just kind of a moralistic teaching on sexuality, and how the church has missed that richness. That's why it's important, because we need to be thinking about these things, and we need to be mining the depths of this biblical truth and what all it communicates, and ultimately, as you say, the glory of God that we've missed out on. And I mean, I remember as you were talking about abstinence, which, for the record, we're both for, but just kind of some of the moralistic teaching. I think it's Lauren Winner's book, Real Sex.
Oh, great book.
written years ago, and
Yeah.
one of the chapters or either sections is lies the church teaches, and one of those lies is that sex before marriage is not pleasurable. That fornication, and her just saying that's not true. That there were plenty of times, and I think a little bit of background of the book. She was not a believer, but then became a believer later in life, and so her just reflecting on some of those lies that the church has communicated, and it's helpful. Obviously, the two of us are part of local churches. The local church is vital. We are in favor of the local church, but we do, as a church, need to look at some of the blind spots that we have and critique and move forward by God's grace to communicate His gospel in a more helpful way. Just to follow up to one of the things you said about silence, I would agree with you that it does seem like we are moving away from that. That it seems like some of the conversations I'm having with parents, they are starting these conversations sooner. There are a few thoughts I have about that, but why do you think we're starting to see some of those trends of maybe more openness to discuss this in the church and the home?
I wish there was a more positive reason for that response, John, but it's okay that it's not. We're being pushed. Mm-hmm. We are being pushed. Mm-hmm. And very oftentimes the church in its history has begun to move into particular territories because the culture has moved us there. And, you have the story or the narrative of race in American history, mm-hmm. and slavery. And though many Christians were in the forefront of that, there was a lot of secular push that woke up the church. Mm. God uses all sorts of things to wake up His people.
Absolutely.
And He's doing that now. So parents are now beginning to realize more and more that, for instance, those cell phones and smartphones that they're giving to their younger children are actually dangerous. And so they're being pushed to say, wait, it's not enough for me to just put some filters and accountability software on these devices, because kids are so savvy, they know how to get around that stuff. They're going to have to start talking about these issues. And I say, great, let the culture push us. We ought to be in the forefront of these things. We ought to be out there as the chief people talking about how to live in ways that honor and glorify God. And that means we have to step down into the messes of people's lives, and not be afraid to roll up our sleeves and get involved and talk and lead and disciple and help people grow. Yeah.
That's very good. And quickly, I know we're needing to wrap this up. Kind of the scenario of the teenagers in the auditorium. If you had an auditorium filled with pastors, what advice would you give them to move this forward in their congregation? And it could just be reiterating your points of some of the negative trends. But what's some just quick advice, counsel, encouragement you would give pastors to move forward in discussing this more?
One of the easiest things to do that we encourage pastors to do is, a good pastoral sermon is going to have lots of anecdotes and illustrations and narratives and stories, but they're all about, problems with money, problems with relationships, etc. But we hardly ever hear anything about pastors saying problems with sex, or pornography, or same-sex attraction. And what we encourage pastors to do is to start sprinkling their sermons with those real-life narratives that are out there, and then connect the gospel to them, recognizing that people in their congregation are already struggling with these things, and they're not saying anything about it.
Yes.
So we use this expression to pastors. You've got to give permission to your people to talk about these things. And the permission they need is for you to start talking about it. If you don't talk about it, they remain silent, hidden, they remain desperate and alone. So just start raising it. Mm-hmm. Even in a simple way like that, you'll begin to get people knocking on your door. That's a good thing.
Absolutely. Nicholas, once again, thank you for that. I know tomorrow, as we close out our conversation with you this week, it's kind of shifting the conversation to parents and giving advice of how to begin some of these conversations. So hopefully more will tune in tomorrow. Thank you again, Nicholas.
Thank you. Good to talk with you, John.